There's few things more common than comedy. Knowing just what to do to make someone laugh is an art, but there's a whole other challenge of knowing how to score that. Making music match and enhance a joke is a deceptively difficult task.
You have to make sure that you're enhancing the joke, not stepping all over it. You want to accentuate it, not bloat it. It all needs to have this neat consistency, and it can be pretty difficult to toe that line. These difficulties are made even more challenging in the world of anime.
With anime, for most series, the music is written long before the composer's seen a single piece of footage. There's so many different ways to approach making music funny, from the experimental prog rock of Cromartie High School to the lush orchestra of Nichijou.
Because of this, a lot of pressure is placed on the music director and music editors to make the music fit, to make the music hit the right beats, and to occasionally make the square peg fit in the round hole, to sometimes mix results. It's a very difficult art that takes a lot of time to master.
I'm Kor, a classically trained violist, musician, and music appreciator.
And I'm Shabu, a professional music director, editor, and composer for almost a decade now.
And you're listening to AMP. So Shabu, as a professional composer, what do you think about the ways that writing for comedy is different from writing for other genres?
So it's really interesting, actually. Fun fact: the first piece of music that I worked like on a film, not total, but like on my own on like a real bona fide film with some heft behind it, was actually for a comedy, and it's always kind of fascinating to write for comedy. It's very different from like editing for comedy, which, well, obviously we're going to be talking about that a lot because we're going to be talking about anime. But when you're writing for comedy, it really depends on a number of factors. You're going to want to think about the normal stuff, right? Like world, consistency. Is it going to make sense in the grander scheme of the soundtrack? Is it going to hit the right beats? If you're scoring to film, then you want to like follow along with the joke. It's kind of like telling a joke yourself. The cue that I'm thinking of that I like, the first cue that I wrote on a film was this kind of humorous dance sequence. And so I did this Latin inspired clarinet and violin in the main line. I want to say it's kind of like a samba. It's been an odd number of years now. But basically I'd have stuff come in and then you'd like drop something out. Had this really nice rhythm to it, and I would have it dip out as something funny was about to happen and then like come back in a little bit stronger. And so each time something funny happened and the pace built, I would add a little bit more. And so it was kind of building up the tension and stuff. And when there was a hard cut to like downstairs where the people were not supposed to find this dancing thing happening, I had this almost horror style suspense music playing as just a complete contrast.
I do wonder, you mentioned the horror style, if there's any similarities when it comes to writing music for comedy and horror, because I know when it comes to literally writing stories, a lot of people mention that comedy and horror are in very similar positions because a lot of it is about understanding the audience's expectations and sort of surprising them and catching them off guard. So I'm curious if there's any of those connections between their musical identities that carry over also.
You know, I feel silly for this now, but because I've never thought of that, and I've written a lot of horror. They're very similar, actually, and I'm much more like familiar and comfortable with horror at this point because I get a lot of horror films. I don't know, but in horror, you're kind of building up suspense to, in this case, what would be the punchline, and in comedy, you're kind of doing the same thing. Obviously, you don't want to oversell something because then you reach into cheesy territory, right? You never want to overstep your bounds. Like, that's the biggest thing, is you want everything in kind of moderation, unless it is your job to kind of shoulder the burden. Like, if you are the sole thing cluing the audience into something being funny, then obviously you're going to want to kind of blow it out of proportion. But
it's kind of a often less is more situation where it's like it's very easy to overwrite something, but sometimes a bit more restraint is like the most powerful tool.
Yeah, I'd say so. Obviously, it's what it's really going to come down to is what the director wants. Because you'll write something and you're like, wow, chef's kiss. This is perfect. It's not in the way or anything. And the director comes in, he's like, can you add in a sliding whistle? And you're like, no. Yeah, I can.
I'm physically capable of doing such a thing.
Yep, it's possible. I've never had that request, by the way. It's just the first thing that came to my mind. But, that is going to shape a lot of what you actually end up writing, is what the director sees when he sees a scene. And obviously, if it's a comedy, he has a vision, or I guess they have a vision. Sorry. I was thinking of the directors, the two directors I generally work with. They're both male. But a director will have a vision for the joke, right? And so they kind of want the joke to be told the way that they think it's going to land. And if they're successful comedy directors, then, they obviously have an eye for it and an ear for it. And at the end of the day, they pay you. So you're going to put what they want into the film, But right. It really is a lot like horror, where you're building up the expectation. You're building up towards generally like a punchline, or you just want like a humorous mood. If you don't want the audience to be laughing, I think that there's a big difference between like a long form joke and a gag, right? And then there's a huge difference between like slapstick and something with really smart humor.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
No,
like,
yeah.
Slapstick, you're going to have a lot more of these really over the top, like accenty musical cues. Whereas like a witty kind of generally drier, like smart humor or long form humor is a lot more of like building up the status quo.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about this in a bit, actually. And we've got a pretty good mix with the shows we're talking about between, gag comedy and long form comedy. And the interesting thing about the long form comedy, which is similar to how I would compose something for a more drawn out comedic style, is that you focus on the story first and the humor kind of like falls into place, if that makes sense.
Interesting.
Because if you have a joke, but it needs to be played off straight, then you can maybe have the music be the straight man, which is, we've got a really great example of that coming up as well. And I think that like long form, I find a little bit more interesting, but I think that slapstick is also, I'm saying slapstick, sorry, but like more overt in your face comedy.
More explosive, it's like trying to have those big like laugh out loud moments. It's like, I think that's the difference between like just like a big like slapstick like comedy movie versus like watching a sitcom, where it's like usually not expecting you to be like laughing uproariously like nonstop. It's a bit more relaxed, like at the normal level that it sits at. Yeah. And that's not to say that long form comedies won't have gags or anything like that, and you won't play off a gag in that kind of way. In fact, again, I've talked about this a little bit, like touched on it, but horror, actually using horror tracks, I don't know if this is more recent, but it's definitely something I've seen a lot recently, is using a full-on horror track to accent something completely mundane is played off as the joke. So without the music, the joke doesn't really work. Yeah.
And there's a lot of cases like that as well. And we see the opposite be true, where something scary, the music is very calm and it's played off like normal, and that's the humor in that. So like,
well, I think you see a lot that like the power of like just musical contrast for the sake of comedy is like an incredibly strong tool. I think like it's really exemplified by just meme culture in general. If you look online, a lot of a lot of really popular memes revolve around one particular piece of music being paired with things that often really don't fit it. And that is the joke, is that the music is paired with something in this sort of context.
Exactly.
And it's because of the versatility of like a piece of music that is good for that. You can just get an infinite number of variations of the same kind of joke through that. And I find that personally, I tend to enjoy music-centered like memes the most out of any of them. I find they get like stale much more slowly than a lot of other stuff does.
Yeah. You really know how to take my inane ramblings and turn them into something that makes sense. But yeah, I mean, that's another thing that you do is, you know, on the flip side of like horror, you'll also sometimes play overly emotional, like very romantic music or something, you know, over something that's really not that special.
Yeah.
You know? But yeah, I think that the long form stuff is maybe sometimes less fun to write. And that's kind of a funny thing to bring up, I guess, for comedy, is how fun it is to write. Mm-hmm. Sometimes when you're writing for a comedy and it's got that really bombastic, like explosive comedy, it can be really fun to write for. It can also be not fun to write for if you feel like it's really generic and not particularly entertaining. I've worked on some weird films, but I mean, like you're kind of gonna get more of a variety in that. And so sometimes, like if it's a hit, it can be really, really fun to mess with. I think that the long form stuff, though, is really, really interesting from like a thinking about it kind of level, if that makes sense. Less of like a let's look at the music itself, but more how the music is written and how the music is used and stuff like that. And I think that I'm going to use this opportunity to transition into our first show. Kobayashi does a great job of this. One thing that Kobayashi does that I find absolutely fascinating is that it's basically built entirely on a few themes, which, you know, first of all, that's awesome for budget because it's easier to write. The recording sessions are also easier because it's under the player's fingertips.
That is smart.
But it's a little bit quicker to write, and it makes sure that everything will sound cohesive to some degree. Kobayashi has a pretty interesting instrumentation list, to say the least, and those like theme and variation style of writing is a very good way to keep things cohesive and have a theme for every emotion. Right.
I think the theme and variations format is just very effective because it's also there's a comfort to the familiarity of it, and you become familiar with it much more quickly. Because I think that is like one challenge with writing music, I would say, is that it can be a bit distracting sometimes if it stands out a little too much, because we hear something new in the background and we're like kind of thinking about like what's going on there. And if you're really trying to keep people present in the scene, it's like, okay, I have this thing that people already know, they're already familiar with. I can change it a little bit so that it works in this different context, but it still has that sense of familiarity, which I think is also that kind of comfort, comfy sense of the hominess, for lack of a better word, is pretty right in tune with the tone of the show as well.
Yeah, I think that's like one of my favorite things. Kobayashi's OST is one of my favorite anime OSTs out there, I think. Not because I think it's like the most insane thing in the world, but I think it's just so creative and the writing is just very clever. something that I really like is that despite it being a comedy, it's actually pretty laid back in its music usage at times. It's not afraid to have silence or empty space, and it will let a joke sit. Where like a lot of these shows we're going to look at really want to move on to the next thing, or like have some kind of sound effect, or like, they want to be moving. Like movement is a big thing in comedy, especially in comedy anime, I feel. And Kobayashi's not as afraid to sit back and chill for a sec, have a couple brews,
Yeah.
And definitely Kobayashi will have a couple brews.
I mean, I definitely would say that of the shows that we're talking about today, Kobayashi and Lucky Star lean more to the relaxed side of the spectrum on comedy. But I think Lucky Star, the way it's written, and we'll get into that later, is more in the vein of how a lot of comedy music is written generally. Whereas this has, I think it goes more for that heartfelt tone rather than just being straight like goofball energy.
Yeah. That's not to say that it doesn't have goofball energy pieces.
Oh, it does.
I think that there's I want to say it's an electric cello. Sorry, it's been a little bit since I've looked at the instrumentation. I mainly looked at the editing this time around, but I did like a full score analysis of it a few years back. I want to say there's like an electric cello or something in one of the theme and variations where they're talking about maids in the first episode in the bar. It plays it plays in a couple different places, but that's like one of the prominent places. Because that's like the first time that things are kind of batshit. So there's a few times where shit goes crazy in Kobayashi in terms of like humor and comedy and stuff like that. But that's kind of the first big like, okay, the show can get this way too. And what they do is they use this kind of chaotic, off the wall, wacky instrumentation.
Yeah, I think
piece to underscore that.
Generally speaking, that is one of the biggest strengths of like the soundtrack, or I think what makes it stand out so much is how it's done from the instrumentation perspective, like what the selection of instruments that are used in it is. This was like my one little piece of like deep dive when I was watching through it, because I've seen the show before, but I hadn't really paid too much attention to the score. I knew it was good, but I hadn't sought it out too much outside of watching the first season. And I listened to the piece Ittakimasu, and I just using the double checking the OST page on VG video, what is it, VGDB?
Video Game Music Database.
Oh, VGMDB, that's what it is. Yeah, I looked at like the credits for like music and then just my ear. And in this one track, there's drum set, violin, tuba, glockenspiel, piano, toy piano, marimba, melodica, acoustic guitar, saxophone, and recorder.
Yeah, that is just the most insane.
That's like, it's collection. A 2-minute track. It's 2 minutes long. That's so much variety.
Oh, it's so good. I also like something that... sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say it's like awesome because not only is that's a lot going on, but it's not like they're all playing at once. They all weave in and out in a way that's very tasteful. Like, I think it would be very easy to just write everybody's going together doing their own thing, but it's divided very carefully into sections, and the ways that the composer chooses to double certain tracks with certain instruments and give one instrument a little solo line. There's some instruments that have very minimal role, like they don't play very many notes in the piece overall, but the small little bit that they do is like so important. And I just think it's super clever and intelligently written.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I was actually I really wanted to go back to the word tasteful that you said, because I thought that was perfect. Like the whole OST is very tasteful. I feel like it has crazy variety. Like if I'm the music editor and music director, I feel spoiled for choice on any given scene, right? Mm-hmm. But like it's very tastefully done. Like we'll look at I think And Yet the Town Moves has crazy variety, but I don't know if they all would fit at all times, you know, whereas like Kobayashi, I feel like it's very cohesive, and the thematically driven nature of a lot of it and how the themes and melodies are realized in the pieces, I think is what makes them so malleable and so usable. Like I think of Kobayashi flying through the sky on Toru, and like that kind of adventurous piece that plays, and this instrumentation really lends itself to that magical atmosphere. It's so bizarre because the twinkly nature of like something like the glockenspiel toy piano and these like childlike instruments not only gives the timbre this magical quality, it also like gives it a childlike and homey quality. Yeah. So you have this like you have this dichotomy because you listen to something like Zigane or the Magician. Is that Saturn? Is Saturn the Magician from Planets? The holds the planets? I don't remember. I'm going to be honest. Someone can fact check me. But off the top of my head, I don't know. But these kind of twinkly, mystical instrumentation, it's doubled in this show, which I find to be an absolutely fascinating little thing, because it's got the magical element, and then it's also got the kind of slice of life comedy element, you know, and it's that marriage of the two, and I think that the instrumentation takes that marriage to the next level, you know.
Yeah, I think it's really funny because when I listen to a soundtrack, most of the time I feel like I can guess what instrument the composer plays, because it's pretty noticeable, or at least what instrument the composer's most comfortable with. Because I feel like a lot of composers will show a bias to certain instrument, be it maybe the string section or the piano or the guitar. Like, it'll lean one way or another. But this is like what I specifically wrote. I was like, this is some of the most unbiased arranging I've ever heard. Like, it completely sounds like one cohesive unit. They're all part of one piece. It's not these different groups. They're all just working as one whole.
Yeah, I totally agree. Do you want my guess, though?
Go for it.
I don't know if this is true. I think they're a guitarist.
My reasoning don't know. I know it's
I don't either.
But I only know of her like singing. I don't know what instrument she might play.
I could be way off base, but people usually don't write like guitar tracks without being guitar composers. So there's like a sad guitar piece, and I could be totally off base. I've definitely heard like one of the composers I work with often, he'll write like an acoustic guitar thing, but he doesn't play guitar, you know. So it happens, but that's my gut. That's my gut feeling. I can't wait to check later, and they're just like a clarinet player or something. But I feel like an idiot.
I do think I just kind of appreciate you were talking about the interesting way that it has with this toy piano and all these twinkly childlike sounds going on. It definitely makes me think of what you would expect from, because Kobayashi definitely leans more into it's like the slice of life field, which I don't really like as a genre descriptor because it's very vague and hard to describe.
It's a non-descriptor, basically.
But everybody has a general sense for what that kind of show is. And when you think of the soundtrack for those kinds of shows, it definitely hits all of those things, like the toy piano, the little twinkly
recorder,
dunk, the recorder. All of that stuff is there, but it's like the composer took all those elements and was like, let's take this as far as we possibly can. Take these really simple baseline elements, because to my memory of watching other series like this, a lot of them they'll take like 2 or 3 of these instruments. You know, you have a bass line going, there's a little melody on top, but it's nothing too complicated.
Mm-hmm.
And Masumi Ito was like, okay, let's take that and make it as complicated as possible, but make it not sound complicated at all. It sounds effortless.
Yeah, it's so awesome. I think to bounce off of that, one of the biggest things for me is actually, and this is going to sound kind of odd, I think a lot of people really resonate with harmonic and melodic content, but for me, I usually like tone color, and this show has that in spades. Mm-hmm. But one of the biggest things for me is actually the melodic and harmonic content is really interesting, and there's a part of it that's the composer's kind of innate, like what they like to write. Because if you listen to Flip Flappers, or you listen to certain tracks off of Flip Flappers, they have the same kind of leading tone writing, where they'll do a lot of these raised notes, like dun, 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 like back up to a note, mm-hmm. or down to a note, and I think that really just makes the contour of, I'm using the big words today, it makes like the shape of the melody really interesting and engaging, and I think that combined with the really interesting instrumentation and the absolutely effortless orchestration makes for just like one of the most unique OSTs, period. I don't think that it's like unique for anime or anything like that. I think it's just an incredibly unique OST. It's not perfect. There's a couple tracks that have very clearly, they are synthetic instruments and they sound bad. Mm-hmm. But I remember talking about this in my analysis. That's made up for because they're played through shitty school speakers, so you can't tell. It's the only time they're used. It's the only time they're used in the show.
Very smart.
But I just thought that was a funny little tidbit. But the writing is absolutely amazing. Like the way that they orchestrate this really just bizarre and usually disparate kind of instruments in this chamber ensemble, we'll call it, is really just like a masterful orchestration. I'm a really big fan of it.
I want to see a live performance of this like insane arrangement of musicians together.
I don't even need to hear them playing. I just want to see them how they arrange it on the stage. That's like, okay, so we've got the toy piano like front left and then
that would be fascinating. I
think go ahead.
I was just going to mention, because I was thinking about another element of it, which is the like literal performance. Because in this case, it's a smaller grouping, so you can hear a lot of those nuances that come from individual performers. And the one thing that stood out to me in particular, because I've studied viola and violin, is how good and also interesting the performance of the violin is in the soundtrack. Since if you're not experienced or not super knowledgeable about the specifics of an instrument, like you might just think, okay, violin, they play melody line, but in this soundtrack, there's a lot of uses of different kinds of sounds that the violin can make. Like the textures that come from how close you are to the bridge, or like letting the bow bounce on the string, or even just like there's a lot of variation in how strong the attack is. Like you can hear that little click from like when it's like a really harsh attack on the string, or like in some cases the violinist like stretches the notes a bit as they come away from it, which you get like letting your bow kind of drift away from the bridge, and it gets kind of wispy at the end of the note, and distorts the tone a little bit. It's like these very small things that you usually wouldn't see, or at least I wouldn't expect, that add that additional layer of nuance to the music as well.
Yeah, and I think that that's present in a lot of the instruments. as well. It's just like, it's really well written, you know? The direction I have to imagine is really good. So either through like the conductor or the recording sessions, or just actually in the sheet music itself. I don't have access to either of those things, so I don't know. But it really just depends on the recording process. But yeah, I think it's great, and I think that ties into my next kind of talking point about Kobayashi, which is that something that makes the lighthearted moments and the comedy and stuff hit harder is that it has moments of real sincerity, and it has moments of like real heartfelt emotion.
Mm-hmm.
Like one of my favorite pieces in all of anime potentially plays in the last episode, like the very last episode at the very end, and it's Oyasumi. Can't remember the rest of the title. Probably should have written that down. If you search for Kobayashi OST Oyasumi, it'll pop up. And it's basically just, it starts off with these vocals doing this like short percussive few short percussive notes into a long held out kind of sweeping note. And it builds on that. And the way that it's like mixed and mastered is absolutely gorgeous. It's so light and airy. And I punched my microphone a little bit. And it just like the way that they mixed it with this kind of reverb and lets the open space be picked. The open space be kind of filled up by the percussive elements of the voice, and some of the lingering melodic elements of it is absolutely gorgeous. And then they bring in the strings and they fill up the rest of the sonic space with that, and then later on a harpsichord, which really kind of just feels fitting with everything to have a harpsichord playing the like kind of rhythmic pulse as well. And I think that and then Sayonara, like another piece that's kind of somber and sad, really add a lot of credibility to the OST in a weird way. I don't know if that's the correct term, but it adds like some ethos to the rest of it, you know.
It hits.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. It hits those genuine emotional beats.
Yeah, and so it makes the comedic moments hit even harder, you know, because they're real characters. You know, they've got like real emotions, and I think that the OST explores all these facets of the characters. I think that's really, really cool and really well done.
Yeah, no, that's great. If you're sincerely invested in the cast of characters, you know, you're there for the funny moments and the sad ones too. And the soundtrack does a great job of capturing that.
Yeah.
Well, I guess, is there anything you wanted to go into on the music editing? Since that's pretty much everything I have myself to say on the matter.
For sure. I can talk a little bit on Kobayashi's music editing. I had kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but they're really not afraid of using empty space, which is really commendable in a comedy, because you really want to fill up all of the space, right? You want there to be something happening all the time. You want the audience to be engaged. You want them paying attention so that they don't miss the joke. They don't miss the like lead up to the joke or anything, right? So you want them to be constantly engaged. And so the restraint to kind of hold back and not use music, I think, is really commendable. And you don't even have to look further than the first episode to see this. There's like not a cue for a pretty large amount of time, especially for a comedy. And it adds to that kind of drowsy, slow feeling in the show, which is kind of intermittently cut up by these comedic moments. Another thing to build on top of that is that there's not a ton of Foley, actually. And the Foley that they do use is very intentional and purposeful. Obviously, there's times where they have soundscapes and stuff like that, but again, if you just look at the first episode, you don't really have to look any further than that to see this in action, where they really want you to focus on what's funny, and they don't really want to take away from that. They want your focus to be on whatever the sound is coming from. And I think it actually adds a lot, like when Toru grabs like Kobayashi's clothes and is munching on them to, quote unquote, clean them. It's like the sound is pretty much just her crunching on the clothes. And it's, a bizarre kind of soundscape.
It's music to my ears.
I think that that's really interesting because, it still has the classic comedy anime thing of accenting quick cuts or something like that on screen. Like if it cuts the actual scene, like does a cut transition, it'll sometimes do some kind of sound effect or a little like jingle or something to accent that. And that's something we're going to be seeing in pretty much all of these shows. It is a very comedy staple, along with bumpers. What are they called in anime? They're called eye catches.
Oh yeah.
With like eye catches with little tiny jingles written for them as well. But yeah, so I think that it's pretty laid back in its music usage at times, and it's not afraid to have silence or empty space, and that lets a joke sit or it lets the plot develop. And if the plot's developing, I feel like it allows for those other things to hit harder. And if you have silence, I've kind of said this probably a few times on this show, that if you have silence, it's a lot easier to draw your attention to the next sound. So
yeah, going from zero to something is a much bigger change than something to something else.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think we've gone pretty in depth with Kobayashi. We can get moving on to the next show, which we're going to be talking about Sayonara Zetsubou-sensei. This is a series that was one of my picks. It's a comedy, it's a more dark comedy, which I always enjoy and appreciate. And I remembered this soundtrack being pretty noticeable and good. It was one of the first things that came to my mind, actually, when we talked about doing a comedy episode. And I think part of the reason I like it is because of how completely willing it is to really get into that drama, but do so in a genuine way. Because
yes,
with this show, a lot of the comedy is how over the top the main character is in his complete despair and a lot of things that really aren't that big of a deal, and just how over the top a lot of the characters are, but playing it somewhat straight in the sense that you're laughing at them, not with them. They don't really have any self-awareness ever, a lot of the time. And so what I think is really fun is that when you're listening to the music, a lot of it is genuinely beautiful. If we're talking about the more dramatic pieces, the more grand, big, like full orchestra stuff, it's not afraid to be sincere, even though the composer's writing it knowing that it's being used for a comedic context. But it's that commitment to the bit, like just staying in it, that enhances the humor even more. And that's because I think a lot of comedy OSTs that I hear usually tend to do the drama, but they play it up really hard. They push the drama element. They get as sappy as possible and ham up all those emotions. And in this case, it definitely is on the like upper end of how dramatic things are willing to get. But there's an earnestness to the way it's written that I could see these pieces being conceivably used in a serious emotional context, which is why it's so much funnier that they aren't.
Yeah, my first note says like from the very first scene of the first episode, the soundtrack is pretty unique in the realm of comedy anime because it like matches the animation and writing style, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. It's overly serious and it plays things like straight and artistic, which I think is fascinating. Like it's very much along the lines of what you were saying. The visual style is very artistic, mm-hmm. and the writing of the show and the way that they talk is very like artistic and sometimes poetic, and like, you know, they're kind of hamming it up a little. And I think that the music aids this to great effect, just like everything on this list still utilizes the like hard cuts for comedy, but the editing in this like plays itself more seriously than other comedy. Mm-hmm. That's like what makes the funnier sound effect, or times when it accents the comedy, it like stands out more because it's normally playing it so seriously. It's almost playing it like a drama sometimes.
Yeah. No, for sure. And I guess I don't want to give the wrong impression that it's like just this kind of like dramatic tracks, because it definitely has a wide variety. Which I think is actually one of the interesting things that we didn't exactly go too into. But another element of comedy, I think, is that with a lot of comedy shows, especially ones that are more in the vein of this, where a lot of it is driven by this huge variety of bits or like short sequences of like a gag that follow a certain like train of thought and build jokes on that, is that these kind of shows that were like oftentimes adaptations that were designed to be serialized for a long time and do this, just run different jokes with the same set of characters, is that there's going to be a lot of variety in the settings and subjects that these characters are being placed into. So you're also going to need a lot of variety in the music, because a lot of these kind of shows also like to do parody or put the characters in different settings, things in that vein. And that's another thing that the soundtrack has a lot of, is there is a really, really wide variety of musical styles. Like I was writing down, I got hints of reggae, romantic classical, easy listening, 70s jazz funk, 60s pop, tango, samba, Russian folk, and a bunch of other stuff that I couldn't immediately like figure out just off the top of my head. A lot of like folksy sounding pieces, which I think is pretty effective, because even though most of the characters in the show are Japanese, they're so diametrically opposed in personality that having all these really wide range of styles is a smart thing to do for writing a show like this.
Yeah, I actually really like the music selection in this show a lot. I think it's from the wide variety that they have, I feel like they do a really good job of narrowing it down to the right thing to play at the right time. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think my favorite joke that I had seen in the show is in the first episode. It's really dark, but this is like a good example of the music selection when the girl is talking about her parents trying to make themselves taller. It's played very innocently and sweetly, and the music in the background is like very innocent of what she's talking about, when she's really talking about, you know, her parents kind of, you know, something very dark.
Yeah. Something involving a rope and maybe a step ladder.
Making themselves taller. But the music selection is great. And that's like, I think I wrote that down specifically in my notes, because even out of all of the jokes that I had seen, which I thought were all great, that one specifically stood out to me, because I was like, yeah, this is a good crystallization of like the good music selection and good music.
Yeah.
Like, editing and stuff. Something that kind of on that note, if you look at some of the jokes around that joke, you'll notice something that the editor or director really liked to do, which was have a cue end, have a sound effect play like a bird call, and then the punchline hits in that exact cadence every time. It happens like 3 times in the first episode. And it's just a funny thing to pay attention to. I think it's a pretty effective trick, especially if you're not doing what we're doing and obsessing over the shit that nobody cares about. No, people care about it, but it's a pretty effective trick and something that I'll keep in my back pocket for sure in the future.
Yeah, I guess that's a fun bit of way to play with how to end or cut off a track. Like there's only so many ways to do it, but that's a fun sort of formula. I think gives it a bit of a like 1-2 punch for when the punchline comes.
I think it's kind of funny because it's, if I remember correctly, it's been a bit since I've seen Monogatari, but I think Monogatari does something very similar, but not like necessarily with punchlines, where it'll like play something and then it'll hard cut on one of those like screens, and then it'll go back and it'll be like Foley or noise. And so the cadence felt very similar to Monogatari, which was kind of bizarre. But something I wanted to bring up, because we talked a little bit about this when talking about writing for scores. One thing that I really liked in this show was how often that I saw the music like doing the joke. So like if something ridiculous was happening, sometimes instead of having a straight man on screen, like between the characters, the music would be the straight man, like playing it serious and adding in the humor, you know? And I think that that's a really cool concept. It really makes the music feel like a part of the show.
When everybody's crazy, the music's the straight man.
When everyone's crazy, nobody is. But yeah, so I thought that was really interesting that they'd have the music actually kind of take the brunt of the joke occasionally. I liked that.
Yeah, no, that's very smart. I guess I guess one other note I had is I felt like just like a final bit of addition into like the diversity of the soundtrack is, it seems like it was written with in a way that I think could be pretty versatile, just because there's a lot of very varied tracks, but then there's also a lot of tracks that are super consistent, like the kind of tracks I feel like you could drop almost anywhere. They're, you know, the rhythm's tight, they're consistent volume and general like tone the whole way through. You could cut them like pretty much anywhere. And then there's all these super exaggerated, bombastic, emotional tracks also. So it gives you, it gives the like music editor space to work with for playing up a scene, or sometimes it's like you just need music in the background for a scene and you need something that's going to be functional. Because if all you have is tracks that are designed to convey a very, very specific kind of emotion, then I feel like it's likely you're going to end up running into situations where you don't have something that can fit the bill because the music gets too specific.
Yes, I think that a lot of shows run into that problem where they don't have filler pieces. Filler pieces are freaking important. You need something to place when nothing's going on, you know? So yeah, I could not agree more with that.
Well, I guess I've complimented this a lot. There is one small thing I do want to critique. It's something that I don't even think I would really notice if I wasn't specifically going out of my way to listen closer to things. But the soundtrack does have a proper string ensemble. There are a couple spots where I think it might be like a strings patch, or maybe it's like a mix of both. But it's something to do with the mix where it makes the strings sound noticeably more artificial. I think it's particularly it's because like the tracks that sound nice sound so nice that it's like when you listen to that and then you listen to one of the ones where the strings sound a lot weaker, it's very, very noticeable, the difference. And this partially has to do with how the sound is edited, because I think there were some cases where they were combining two different takes of like one run through on a piece, and you can hear like things like it, like in the middle of a passage, it like fade out and then fade back in a way that like wouldn't happen, or like it kind of abruptly cuts because the takes aren't like perfectly like married together. I guess one I wrote down one, if you want to look it up yourself, anyone listening. Stalker Juzu Tsunagi is one track I noticed this happen in. There's a couple other tracks that are like that. It's not super common, but it was enough to the degree that I thought I'd make a note of it, because it stood out to me and I thought it was worth getting into the details. If we're going to get into the details of the positive, it's worth acknowledging some of the potential negatives as well.
On the note of negative, I've got one negative note about the music editing, which was something. It's kind of funny because I kind of praised something similar about the score a little bit earlier, but there were times where it has like a random cut, or it has a really harsh cut, and some of the sound design decisions. I think that instead of having these like cuts and then sound, or something like that, I think you could just keep playing it out straight, because I feel like some of the humor in some of the jokes are with it kind of being awkward and being not like the characters not being self-aware, and so like the music continuing to go would kind of play along with that. And I think that that's maybe more modern comedy, and it's the editing and cadence and pace of the editing and like sound design and stuff like that is a lot more like 16 years ago than the mid 2000s. But I think that if it were like a modern day production, then continuing those out and having that be like a little bit cleaner would actually get some more laughs in the current day and age. I can't really talk to how well the sound direction landed when it came out. So it was a long time ago. But in current day, I think that it playing out totally straight would in some cases do a little bit better, just as some variety, if nothing else.
Yeah, no, I see what you mean. Well, overall, it's a pretty good soundtrack. I do think there's more tracks on it that I was less jazzed about when I revisited it, because I think there's certain really standout tracks that you remember. And those were the ones I mostly remembered, but more towards some of the more basic, like pulling from different cultures. It's aren't as interesting. Specifically, some of the tracks that lean more into like film parody sound and more like electronic. I think a lot of the more electronic heavy stuff isn't as strong as the more traditional, but overall it's still pretty good. And I think like watching the episode, even the tracks that I don't like as much on their own are pretty effective in context.
Yeah.
And especially any of the like classical or folksy sounding tracks that really lean into that like macabre, mysterious soundscape are like really great. Composer Tomoki Hasegawa also worked on the soundtrack for Mysterious Girlfriend X, which also has a lot of those like really fun and charming, mysterious sounding tracks. So it seems like he's really good specifically at that kind of tone. Those were like always my favorites on it.
Yeah. Do you have anything else you had for Zetsubou?
No, I think that about rounds it out. So we could go over into the next show, which
wait. Yeah, I was gonna say that the oh man, now I'm getting cold feet. Core, the tracks that they really hit, just like hitting happens a lot. Cromartie High School.
Okay.
How was my delivery?
That was I think one of the best segues
it.
I've ever been present for, actually.
This is our token older anime pick. Talk to me, Court. Talk to me about Cromartie and get the bad taste of my joke out of everyone's mouths.
Well, Cromartie is a show that I have heard about a lot. It's kind of considered one of the more classic comedy anime. Bit on the older side. I had seen a couple episodes of it in the past, but I didn't remember too much about it. But when I was looking around for shows to cover, this one came to mind. And for a similar reason as another show we'll talk about later, I picked it because the entire soundtrack is done by a band. It's Bikyo-dan. They're a prog rock band. Apparently took a lot of influence from King Crimson. And that reason alone, I was immediately like, okay, a prog rock band scoring an anime comedy, like this I have to see. Like that just sounds fascinating. I'm not like the most experienced with the world of rock in general, but like also especially like prog rock is not like something I've really done a lot of research or like a deep dive into. But the idea of that sound being applied to something like this, I think, is enough to make it stand out.
It definitely makes for some really interesting pieces. There's like some kind of token comedy pieces where they've got the I want to say, crap, I can't remember the name of it. It's like steel drum. There's like a steel drum kind of sounding one. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, there's like really interesting and fascinating guitar pieces. There's a lot of guitar-centric pieces, I think, because it's a band. They're kind of comfortable with that. Like funky distorted guitar or acoustic guitar or distorted acoustic guitar. And it's really interesting to see the variety in just that, right? Like obviously there's the other pieces that don't use guitar, but I'm saying just like within the pieces that do use guitar, the way that they change the timbre and they change the like range of it and stuff and how they use it is really fascinating and honestly like pretty effective. I think it's a pretty effective score.
Yeah. No, I was surprised by how well it fits for how weird it sounds.
Especially the sorry, I don't mean to cut you off.
No, go for
it. The show being about a kind of like delinquent school really sells the like guitar and like the guitar based kind of grungy, like maybe that's people are gonna be pissed. Rock people are gonna be pissed that I used the word grungy.
No,
I mean it like kind of like dirty and kind of what I'm saying.
Yeah, it's
got that kind of messy sound to it.
It's those uncomfortable kind of odd sounding melodies. Definitely fit with the, well, it's just a cohort of weird rebellious freaks. Like that's the entire show, is all these like really like overly like angry delinquent characters, but they're also just really strange. And so then the musically, it's also has, because it's like rock, so there's that rebellious kind of energy, but because it's a more experimental group, it also gives it that tinge of weirdness. Especially, it's like some of the tracks on this are especially strange. I mean, not only like, because the main group of the band it's a bassist, guitarist, drum player, and a violinist. That's like pretty much the whole affair. I think there's some tracks that have like instruments outside of that, but that's like the root of it. And some of the tracks literally sound like they're like the band is just in the like next the classroom over, like noodling around and improvising in the background.
Dude, it actually does. I know there's this one piece that left like a pretty big impact on me, which was it's pretty avant-garde. It uses this very atonal and harsh like violin playing very heavy with the bow and doing like a ton of double stops and shit.
Yeah.
And then there's like an electric guitar kind of vamping in the background and they're like almost fighting against each other. It's so chaotic, but it was like left such a big impression on me.
I think I know like exactly what moment you're talking about too, because I like noted down like there's this moment where it's like sitting on this progressively building like really dissonant chord.
Yeah.
And then it just cuts like abruptly for the punchline, and it makes it so funny. Like it's just like, because cutting music for punchline, standard fare, but when the music's that intense, the cut is like from 100 to 0. It's like even more of a impact.
It's like hitting the brakes, but like most shows hit the brakes from 60 to 0. This show goes from 60 to hitting a wall. Like, and something that's like really fascinating is that I'm going to say something that is not going to make a lot of sense at first. This score is a lot like Kobayashi's. Now I'll explain why. In its uniformity. Because Kobayashi is pretty chaotic and all over the place too, but the actual like composition of them is like similar in a weird way, and the style of that composition is pretty uniform. If I remember correctly, I don't know why I didn't note this down, but I'm pretty sure it's got this very kind of almost simplistic, plonky kind of rhythm in a lot of the like main melodies, but the actual melodies are kind of chromatic and odd. But the thing that really brings it together is that even though the pieces are like drastically different, they're often cohesive through instrumentation. So if they're not cohesive through like melody and harmony, they're cohesive through instrumentation,
right?
Like through all that usage of guitar and stuff like that. That's why I'm saying it's kind of like Kobayashi, because it either is glued through harmony and melody or it's glued through instrumentation, but the overall end result, despite a crazy amount of variety, is a pretty, honestly, very cohesive soundtrack that sounds like it's from the same show.
Yeah. No, that definitely makes sense with all the same instruments. And even in the case of like the group itself, they've been around for, I think they formed, I want to say late 80s, if I am remembering right from when I did a bit of research. So they're, I think the members varied a little bit, but this group is pretty comfortable together. So it definitely has that sense of uniformity, even in how out there it is from what you might anticipate.
Yeah.
I also think that one of the ways that it enhances the comedy, because at the end of the day, it's for a comedy show. One of the ways that I think it actually really helps build on that is because the music is very unusual in the way that the melodies, like the contour of the melodies is. They're very, it's very much the kind of melodic writing that's like whatever we can do to be as unexpected and like opposite from what you would expect in like a very conventional piece of music is what we're gonna do.
Yeah, totally.
And that randomness, it's not random. There's clear intent to the way that it's played, but that sense of randomness because you can't anticipate what's happening musically, adds to the comedy. Because it's like a lot of these pieces of music, you could cut like anywhere and it would, like, that in itself would be kind of funny, because it's this almost sense of unease from how the music establishes it. Whereas with more, I guess, generally pleasing and slightly more obvious musical writing, a lot of them have moments where they'll kind of build a little bit so that then you can cut, and then you have a bit of a more dramatic moment to have a comedy beat. But this like doesn't even necessarily need to do that because of the just nature of how the melodies themselves are performed. It's really, really interesting. I haven't heard any anime score that I can think of that's like anything like this.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because this ties into my kind of biggest point in my notes, which is that the editing is very snappy. It's so like you'll hear me say this about And Yet the Town Moves. Mm-hmm. It's very snappy, incredibly quick cue changes, never lingering too long. But I find there's a good mix of laid back and upbeat or ridiculous, you know? I think that is aided incredibly heavily by the fact that it's just freaking weird, you know? And like, it doesn't really need to build to cut. What is awesome about that from an editor's perspective, when I'm thinking about like directing or editing, is that the episodes are 10 minutes long. And about a minute to a minute and a half of that is taken up by the OP. Mm-hmm. This means you have to budget your music much less, but you have to also be more careful with where you use it and how. The cues on average will be short and need to transition or present info very, very quickly. So like, you really don't have a lot of time. So the music being written the way that it is actually helps because the show is shorter. And because they're 10 minutes, so there's a lot more that's going to be happening. The cuts are going to be a lot quicker and stuff. So it's just a fun little interesting factoid and like little thing to note and to actually think about with the application of it is that all these quick cuts and stuff make a lot of sense in a 10-minute show.
Awesome. No, yeah, that's a part of it that I didn't even consider, but the literal length of how much you have to work with also makes a huge difference in how you're going to approach working with the music.
Music director brainworm. So how much music needs to go into this? How much empty space is there?
Well, I guess that's most of what I have to say. Obviously, I can't personally offer too much specific critique or commentary because I just don't know that much about prog rock. So if you are knowledgeable about it, check this out. Let me know what you think about it. I would love to hear your thoughts on it.
I would read a lengthy comment on it for sure, because I don't know shit about prog rock. I know that they use oh no, I'm thinking of math rock. Never mind. I'm not going to embarrass myself any further.
Yeah, I rest my case.
Yep. So Nichijou.
How about that Nichijou though?
How about that Nichijou? Something that we talked about with Cromartie is the use of short cues during small gags as a way to help the viewer distinguish stuff. I maybe didn't say that it was to help the viewer distinguish stuff. I'm going to say that now. Something interesting in Nichijou that we've seen a little bit in previous shows is that the use of short cues during small gags is a way to help viewers distinguish, like subconsciously, a way to like separate things from the world or separate things from the plot. When you're looking at like a disparate, separate gag. Like when the gag is baked into the world, it's a little bit different. But if you see these like really short 5-10 second gags, they usually have completely different music or sound. And I think that that's really interesting. And Nichijou does that a lot. Obviously, I know what we're going to talk about with Nichijou. It's the absolutely gorgeous, like classically written score. To me, it like kind of reminds me of a ballet. I love the music a lot. It's funny enough.
So beautiful.
It's really gorgeous. Funny enough, I think there are times where it's a little too loud. It stands out a little too much. The mixing is a little bit much for me. I can understand where they're coming from, though, because the music is absolutely gorgeous. I think something that's really cool for me personally is how they take something that has been done to death, which is like this concept of a much more classical or like quote-unquote art music sound, but because of the application and the material it accompanies, it ends up being really pretty original. In some ways, it reminds me of something like Ravel's one-act comedy about the clockmaker. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to pretend to pronounce the name and embarrass myself. I would definitely recommend watching it, reading into it, listening to it, whatever. It's hilarious. But because of the medium like anime, the Nichijou, like Nichijou is really, really interesting because the tropes and general flow and more modern humor, the music feels like a totally new and fresh take on the whole thing, and it gets a whole new life in this genre. I find that to be really, really fascinating.
Yeah, no, it's so, it captures that like style incredibly well. That just lush, super classical, like Tchaikovsky, bit of Brahms, maybe a dash of Ravel, like classical film score sound almost, like so well. But because it's in this kind of context, it's like a whole new world of possibility. And yet it kind of gives me a bit of throwback. This is not even something I had like thought about much before, but I was just listening to some of the soundtrack, and one of the comments that I was reading, and I'll just quote this directly, is, "My favorite Nichijou tracks are the ones that sound like Golden Age music. Can't you just hear this in an old Bugs Bunny short?" And it never occurred to me to draw that comparison, but Nichijou and like that classic Warner Bros. Like style, the way they do comedy is actually not that different. And so having that musical connection is also super fascinating.
It is good. I hadn't really thought of that before. I should have, though. So I thought of it for the Strike Witches spinoff. How did I not think of it for Nichijou?
You've got your priorities in order.
Yeah, I did write that certain lines reminded me of Toy Story. Like particularly, I think it was the some like clarinet lines were very Toy Story-esque. Mm-hmm. The tracks that I've listened to a lot are mostly like bouncy. They're kind of like ballet tracks, and I think that that's like really great in a comedy because like the Bugs Bunny or whatever, it's got really great sense of inertia or something. It like has movement, and so like in a comedy, you really like movement, especially in comedies like this. I would be totally out of my depth doing comedy like this, by the way. I've done a lot. Like, film is very different because you have a really long period of time to do things, and these, like, comedy anime are really, really snappy. But, yeah, I think when it hits those same kind of beats, and the gags hit the same with the music, kind of like an old Warner Bros.
Oh,
I think that's good.
I do want to. When you say snappy, you mean just in terms of specifically like the writing, or do you mean like the turnaround time that's expected for what you are writing?
Both. I hadn't thought of the second. I more meant like the actual what you see. The visuals is a very like quick cuts, a lot of like short gags, a lot of like it's you don't linger on stuff too long. Like the first thing I worked on for a comedy film was that one scene, and it was like 4 minutes long. You're not going to get one whole scene scored for 4 minutes in like a comedy anime usually, because that's like 4 minutes out of 20 minutes that you have, and make it more like 18 minutes. So then there's 14 minutes left for anything else, and that's just like not a lot, not like feasible outside of something like a long form kind of thing. I think tying it back to Nichijou has kind of these segments. It's like separated and stuff. And I think that it actually is pretty good about lingering on a piece of music for a good period of time. I'm going to be a little harsh. I'm going to be a little bit critical. And so I thought that the music direction was a little flat at times. I think that the hard cuts for comedy are a staple, and they're fine. But some of the music selection, the music is gorgeous. But some of the music selection was a little weird to me, where it didn't feel like it fully fit.
Right.
That hurts me to say because I love the music so much. But there were times where I was like, this is not like a perfect fit. And because the music then the mixing is so loud, it's more noticeable. Yeah, I thought there's like a lot of stuff to really love in each show. Another little factoid is that there's a piece that uses a celeste or like a bell or something, and it mimics a school bell. It's not exactly the same. The second and fourth notes are altered, but I thought it was a really cute and fun way to do it because of Nichijou.
Yeah, no, that's cute. I think, man, I'm blown away by how much like quality there is in the music, because like the crazy thing with this score is not only is it really high quality in terms of just how it is written, it is very, very well written. It's an experienced composer. The composer is Yuji Nomi. He wrote the music for Whisper of the Heart, The Cat Returns. Actually, unfortunately, has not really worked on that many projects. I was looking through his like catalog, which maybe he works more slowly. I don't know. Maybe that's why it's so good. Because
takes time.
The standard of quality is really consistent, and it's like 90 tracks in the score. It's like easily over 2 hours of fully scored orchestral music, which is
holy shit,
a lot.
That is, for people who don't know, that is a lot of music. Like a lot of music.
It's so much. I mean, I'll say there's some pretty obvious moments if you're listening where it's pulling from other classical music, like other classical pieces. But if that's good enough for John Williams, it's good enough for me.
Yeah, John Williams does a little bit more than pulling.
Yeah. The yoink, it's important. Well, yoink, I just want to point that out because it's like you have to do certain things when you're writing this much music. There's like ways that you can make the process a little bit faster, and that's
what they say, right? All good composers borrow, great composers steal.
Exactly. I guess yeah. What was there something you wanted to add?
What were you, did you want to finish a thought? I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I was actually going to take it to a slightly different point. There's something you want to add on the subject first.
I was also going to take it to a slightly different point. So we're at a little bit of an impasse. You go ahead.
We have to fight to the death first. I just I wanted to mention, it's not even like a big subject, but I just thought it was interesting because I get the sense, and this has partially to do with the fact that this is a KyoAni show, and I know KyoAni, from what I understand, has a more less time crunchy schedule, in the sense that they tend to get a lot of stuff done like beforehand. They're pretty mindful of the production like pipeline for the shows they produce, because you mentioned and we mentioned in the intro, most anime don't have stuff scored to the scene, right? That's very rare because a lot of the time it's done beforehand. But there is at least one scene in Nichijou that is directly scored. It's a 4-minute long sequence where they're assembling a tower of cards. There's no sound effects or voice acting whatsoever. It's just the music and visuals, and the music is paced like with the visuals, in a way that like one had to be, accommodating to the other directly, which I was like, whoa, that gives me the sense that they were like working in a time scale that a lot of these shows might not usually be able to.
Yeah, that's really good. That is very good to hear. And hey, that ties into my point, which is that's something that like this style of music really aids with, is that it's so noticeable that when it's absent or there's a different style of music, hell, even when there's like contrasting sound design, you really feel it.
Yeah.
I'll often talk about the first episode in these things because they're the least spoilery and they're the easiest to go and look at yourself. If you're curious why I mostly use examples from the first episode, that's why. I have an example from the first episode, which is during the lunch scene. The show has, at this point, established the score and established that it likes to play lots of music. So when it's really like quiet leading up to the lunch scene, you feel it. And when the masculine choir comes in, you really feel it. I think another really good example, the same episode, is the principal's speech. Because again, the show has established that it likes to use a lot of music. It is a very musically heavy show.
Mm-hmm.
When the principal is talking, it is almost dead silent. And you really feel the absence of music here. But the thing that really hits you as the viewer is when the principal makes a joke that I actually thought was kind of funny, but whatever. It's supposed to be really awkward and not funny, but I thought it was kind of funny. The students just like awkwardly stand there, and during the panning shot, there's like this really weird hum that plays. It just kind of sounds like electronic noise for a second, and it only plays during that panning shot, and it really sells how awkward it is, and it just stands out so much against like the backdrop of this gorgeous like classical music, these sweeping orchestral pieces that's just like in this one panning shot. It's freaking great.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, it definitely has those moments where it gets out of this style that is so deeply entrenched throughout the whole soundtrack and you get so used to, and then it jumps out a lot when it dares to venture into different tones. I mean, I think it's really emblematic of like the composer's like skill in writing, because even when it's not doing that style that you're like used to, it's still like really good. Like I'm thinking specifically of the Helvetica standard stuff, because that's like I think the biggest example of when it gets into different territory, because a lot of the Helvetica standard, it's intentionally trying to be weirder and very different in soundscape from the normal show. So it has a lot more like electronic, like synths and those kind of sounds that aren't used as much elsewhere. But it's still super memorable. Like that main, like even just the title, Helvetica Standard, like that's alone is like just inspired. And the weird, super strange background music that, like, I don't know if you've seen, is also like was kind of like a meme to just put that background music underneath general weird footage of anything. Like so perfectly captures just the batshit insane absurdity of like the Helvetica Standard segments.
Fun fact, when you said Helvetica Standard, it played in my head. Just instantly.
It's that memorable. It's really impressive. Excuse me. But yeah, no, for me, this is definitely like just generally one of my favorite scores because it's the kind of soundtrack that, like, when I'm watching the show, I just like I immediately just sort of sink into it because it's such a pleasing, aesthetically audio. If there was a way to express the aesthetics of audio, that's what I think of in how pleasing it is. It's like lying down in a really comfortable bed. The soundscapes that Yujinomi lays out. So for me, it's always like, even in the moments that it's not the best at enhancing the comedy, it definitely enhances my enjoyment of my life in a general sense.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
I also think just a lot of the tracks are really good at holding up well on their own, but also enhancing what they accompany. It's surprisingly good at doing both of those, since I definitely think there's cases where things lean more towards one side or the other, where they might be really good on their own, but they end up being distracting in the show, which does happen sometimes, like you pointed out. But a lot of the tracks, I think, are actually pretty good at balancing things. There's a pretty good reason I'd say it was one of my favorite soundtracks to use for background music back when I was regularly making like analysis videos, because it hits that lightly comedic tone, but it's also just kind of generally pleasing to listen to, but it's not too distracting. Like, it captures all of those elements, and it has enough forward motion that it's not like boring. That's super good at what it does.
Yeah, it is, as the kids say, goated.
Well, I guess, do you have any final thoughts on Nichijou?
No, and yet the podcast moves. Sorry, I gotta stop. I gotta be stopped.
That one was actually kind of good, though. That one was actually kind of good.
All right. So yeah, anyway, the next was And Yet the Town Moves. It's a pretty varied OST. It has some really interesting sound direction. Some of it actually interacting with the music itself, like the Foley interacts with the music itself. Speaking of sound direction, it's pretty impressive. There's a very rich soundscape and a lot's going on kind of at most times. Not always, but most times. This is used to bolster the various cuts and activity happening on screen. There are a ton of cuts. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of very, very short cues. It keeps the show moving very quickly, and it never lingers on a moment too long unless they really want it to. A big thing with the sound direction is the over-exaggeration, which is pretty common, but it's kind of like harsh in this case. Mm-hmm. The first episode has these almost intense cuts with big crescendoing sounds into silence, or a cut, like just a really abrupt end. Then there's this running theme of ice shifting in a glass cup and making a sound. It makes the sound you would expect, actually, but it's like always isolated. And the way it uses that and the cuts almost reminds me of Monogatari, which I've brought up before, which is weird. But it's odd in And Yet the Town Moves. It's like mixed in an almost like ADHD sound direction.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean that incredibly affectionately, by the way. I think it's really well done.
Add that I haven't looked into it for like the sound direction, music editing and stuff, but those shows And Yet the Town Moves, Sayonara Zetsubou-sensei, Monogatari are all Shaft, so it might conceivably be the same guy.
I mean, that does that does kind of line up, doesn't it? Yeah, I think it's really well done. It produces this like really heavy whiplash that aids the comedy aspects. I think that it's not always perfect. I think that sometimes it's overdone. Kind of like in Zetsubou, where it kind of starts getting to be overdone when you like see it so many times that it's predictable, because you don't want something to become predictable that it loses the joke. But yeah, if you just like, I seriously just watch the first episode and pay attention to how many like foreground sound effects there are, and then how many music changes there are, you will be astounded. It is so ADHD. I say this as an ADHD person. It's all over the freaking place, man.
No, that's really interesting. I mean, I guess the energy of the show itself is pretty goofball, so
very chaotic.
I can see that matching up well. I will point out that, like, the reason this was like one of my personal picks for shows to talk about. The reason I picked this one is kind of similar to the reason I wanted to talk about Cromartie, and that's because, again, it's like the case of a band doing the soundtrack, which is, I just generally think that's always interesting, because I feel like the way that like a specific unit that's known for doing actual songs coming to doing like scoring something is, I'm just always fascinated how they're going to approach that.
Yeah.
Which in one sense, this is actually a lot more normal than I would have anticipated for a band that hasn't really that I can see done a score before. Because the group that's doing is Round Table, who you probably know for doing the theme song for Chobits, Die Buster, NHK. They've done a lot of really iconic music. Very much like icons of the Shibuya-kei like genre, or like general musical niche. The musical style of this, though, is a bit different. They really rolled with the Seaside Cafe element of the show, because the base musical identity is like all centered around that. It's a lot of like surf rock. It's like calypso, a lot of Brazilian bits of music, island kind of sound, all of those like areas, just anything that can make you think of being on a beach is like what the music is going to do. Which I do think is fun. Personally, I do wish it actually committed to it more.
I agree.
Because like initially I went into it and I was like, oh, I wish they had just done straight up Shibuya-kei, because it's my favorite genre. They're really good at it. I want a Shibuya-kei soundtrack. But setting aside my personal desires, if we just look at it for what it is, it's like it makes sense that they chose this because it fits with like part of what the show is. But I think it would have been even more interesting if it was like 100% going all the way with that sound, because that's like there's enough tracks that are in that beachside style that I notice it as being an intentional choice, but it's not enough of it that it seems to be like fully committed to it. Because I think generally most of the chill tracks are in that style, but anytime it tries to get more absurd or dramatic, it completely changes style. It'll go to more like of a waltz or like more classical. If it's trying to get like really dramatic, I noticed stuff like in that area. But what I think would have been more fascinating is if it tried to convey those emotions while keeping the same style. Because like you think a lot of the time you think it's interesting when you have a lot of musical variety in styles. But when you have a very defined musical and like a defined and unique musical identity, then I think it's actually more interesting when you have to convey this wide range of emotions within this singular framework. That like challenge of making it fit into that style actually ends up being more interesting than just jumping around to a bunch of different styles.
I super agree. I also think that this leads to an issue of some of the tracks kind of don't fit sometimes. Not necessarily in a bad way. It makes sense with just like how jam-packed the show is in terms of cues. When they hit. But like the variety and stuff can be kind of tiring at the pace at which the like sound and music moves along with the show. Like in terms of composition, you were talking about that, and like I was like, yeah, I found myself just like nodding along, like, yeah, I totally agree. But I also like, I was a big fan of the jazzier tracks. I think that they had like the right amount of mischief to them, and some of the tracks have some really clever like instrumentation and orchestration. Something that I noted was that a lot of the tracks have a very small instrument list. I think this might be in part because of how many cues there seem to be and how short they seem to be. Like, they don't seem to be very long cues. Some of these things seem to be kind of just like little blurbs that they can chuck in anywhere. But those tracks feel like they have a little bit more of like a less is more approach, but I don't feel like they're necessarily lacking. But I do think that the consistency is part of the issue that I have with like how hyperactive the score or the transitions are. Because if it was like more cohesive, they maybe wouldn't stand out as hard cuts as they do.
Right.
But they might not be. It does get tiring. Again, not necessarily in a bad way, but it does get kind of tiring because you're like, whoa, it's like when someone's talking really fast at you and they're like, blah, 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 and you're like, oh, okay.
I got to keep up with this.
Slow down a little bit. You know, I feel like that happens, and I feel like part of that is because of just the sheer amount of like different genres are going on, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's definitely a factor at play when you're changing so quickly. If you have stuff that's in the same general like space, it sometimes you can even like in cases of really good like music editing, you can almost hide it where it still sounds like it's like one like cohesive piece, even if you're mixing two different things together.
Yeah, the One Piece is real.
It's real.
Sorry, I'm freaking out of it.
But yeah, I mean,
continue.
Generally speaking, it definitely, I think, hits all the notes that like I would expect for a comedy show. I will say it's interesting. I think the ways that it combines some tones, like I say this in terms of personal taste. Again, I would have preferred if they had committed a bit more to a certain style. And I also say that in the sense that some of the styles that they borrow are done so in more of a like take the more superficial elements of it, but it's not like completely committed to that style. Like there's one that's like
derivative.
Yeah, it's a bit more derivative. There's like one that's like, it's like this reggae sounding song, but then there's just this really like slice of life sounding piano. And the way like the melody sounds is like you would never hear that in a reggae song ever. Stuff like that. Though in some cases it's kind of also interesting because it's a bit of a combination of these other sounds with the influence. So it's not like I completely hate it. It's a bit more of like, oh, that's neat that that's the way they chose to approach that. There's like this one really weird sounding track that has like Brazilian influence, and there's like these like really light like vocals in the background, and then also a mouth banjo. It's like super weird and goofy.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny. So it's doing some interesting stuff. I was it's a lot. It's fascinating.
Yeah, it's a hard line to toe.
Yeah.
When you're kind of mixing genres or you're writing in a genre that's not your native style. I have to do that quite a bit, and honestly, it depends on the project. Obviously, I always give it my best effort, but sometimes you don't have time to research everything you want to, and you just have to like, okay, this is a chord progression that sounds like kind of the right thing. That's not to defend them, by the way. It's very, I totally agree. I would just say like the reason for it is that often you'll kind of do something like with spoken accents. When you imitate an accent, you can actually imitate only the most prominent changes, like for some dialects, like vocal vowel changes and stuff. And people will actually not be able to tell the difference who don't speak the language, obviously. It's kind of similar with music. But yeah, so that was basically just to say that line, towing that line is a little bit dicey sometimes because you're trying to do too much and it doesn't always pay off. Sometimes it's really cool. Sometimes it doesn't really pay off. Yeah.
No, I definitely agree. There are certainly some bangers in here. I think like my kind of overall thing is I just wish it feels a little uncommitted. And I would be very interested to see like how Roundtable would like approach a soundtrack in the future. Because
one with more focus, maybe.
Yeah, I think that would be pretty interesting. Was there anything else you wanted to cover on And Yet the Town Moves?
No, I think we hit all of it.
Well, then we can continue into Konosuba.
Ooh.
I don't have as much to say about this one myself, though I will say that when I was revisiting it, I was a bit surprised by how it actually plays a lot of stuff straight. It's kind of similar into some stuff we talked about earlier, but a lot of the music sounds just very much within that sphere of what I would expect from fantasy isekai like soundscape and writing. And in fact, the guy who did the soundtrack, Masato Koda, did a lot of work on Monster Hunter. So clearly they're comfortable with that general fantasy aesthetic.
Yeah. That was my first note, actually, is that this plays more like a long-form comedy, and so it like follows more like a quote-unquote normal anime would in terms of pacing and direction. I actually really like the music, too. It's very classic RPG, but it's got some budget behind it. It like at least it's what I would imagine an RPG with some budget behind it sounding like. Maybe not a modern day one, like XB3 is just... Anyway, it's not an XB3 video. The writing is really solid. I am actually a really big fan of the orchestration in particular. The supporting lines and harmonies are really well fleshed out and incredibly neatly written. And honestly, it's just really charming. When we talked about like shows to cover, I knew a couple I wanted to hit for sure, like Kobayashi, Nichijou. But when I went to check out Konosuba, because we had like this long list of shows to look at, I was kind of taken aback because I didn't remember the score sounding this nice. But yeah, so like the writing is just really solid. I also like how it how it will like kind of like many other shows play it totally straight, as you said.
Yeah.
Like playing epic music while chasing like getting chased by frogs, then playing an overly emotional piano music like when Agua is crying covered in frog spit, you know.
Yeah. It definitely it falls really in line with just the general show's approach, because a lot of the comedy of Konosuba comes from it playing with what your expectations are for this kind of fantasy story. And so when the music's also playing in line with those expectations, then when the expectations are subverted, you're getting like the music's not giving the joke away, essentially.
Yeah. I couldn't have worded it better myself. The music selection and editing is usually pretty damn solid. Like a good example of this is when Megumin is introduced. There are like 5 or 6 different cues used, and they really do a lot for the humor, punchlines, and atmosphere. Like it's really this like the music selection and editing is not always perfect. Like it's not always this good. There are like, if I have a small complaint, the way the music is mixed sometimes in the show can be hit or miss for me. Sometimes the music is really quiet and you can like barely hear it. I think that you could pump those up a little bit, and sometimes the music's a little bit too loud and it kind of clashes with the voices because the frequency ranges of the two things. But most of the time it hits pretty well, and it's like really just thoughtful, I feel, in its music selection and editing. It's not really phoned in. It feels very thoughtful. Like the music itself too. Like I talked about it before, the orchestration. One thing that I really love about it in particular is how it passes melody lines through different instruments. And I just think it's done so seamlessly and really well. And it's like, you know, it's a classic skill. It's something you learn in school, but I just think that the music is really like neatly written. Not like, ooh, this is neat, but like it's a very like clean score, and not in a what's the word? Like antibiotic kind of way. It's not in a sterile way. Like it's very clean in a good way. And yeah, I don't know. That's like most of my main points about it. I can give you a fun little fact about recording music in general if you want to hear it.
I'll go for it.
There's this one piece that plays a decent amount of times. And it has these strings playing very high and maybe not super loud, like kind of quiet. Like when they were recording that, it might have been told to play like mezzo piano or piano. This leads to a little bit of like loose playing and some pitchiness. The players are not as like tight together, like in the pocket as they should be. This isn't a big criticism at all, honestly, because it's totally just like it's something that happens, and you've got a limited amount of time in the booth. I said in the booth. Why did I say that? You have a limited amount of time with the orchestra, and you're gonna get five takes of a track or something. Really depends on how long you're recording. But something that I have done that I found to be really useful, that anyone listening who records with a live orchestra might find useful as well, is if I have something really loud, or I have like false harmonics or something, for example, something that's maybe a little bit more difficult to play really high up on the bridge, especially for string players. This is true for woodwind players as well, but something I've done when I realize that there's pitchiness occurring is to actually tell them to play 1 or 2 dynamics louder. So play like 1 or 2 dynamics louder than notated, and then I'll make a note of that to send off to the mixing and mastering team to adjust them down in post. And this usually fixes or helps with any pitch issues, especially in those higher ranges.
Awesome.
Just a little fun factoid. Tangent, sorry.
The more you know.
The more you know. But I wrote that down in my notes because I didn't know if I'd ever have a chance to like bring up something like that. And I think that they're fun, interesting little facts that you wouldn't get or know otherwise, because nobody talks about them.
That's what we're here for. Well, I guess I don't really have anything else to say specifically about Konosuba. It's very good at doing what it does. Fully committed, very clean, nice all around. Has my appreciation. So I guess we can move over into Lucky Star.
It's your lucky day.
It's my lucky day. I get to talk about Lucky Star. This is done pretty much, as far as I can see, it was composed entirely by Satoru Kosaki, even though it's when he's a part of Monaka, like the group. But it seems like, from what I was looking at the credits, that the whole thing was pretty much written by him. This is one of those things that is strange in how much I like it, almost, because it is so amazingly simple. It is almost every track on the soundtrack is under 2 minutes. In fact, I would say the majority are between 30 seconds and like a minute 20. So all the tracks are very, very short. They're very simple. It's primarily just a basic, I'd say, like, this is the formula for like maybe like half the songs on the soundtrack. Strong staccato piano chords, you set a chord progression, and then there's a melody that repeats with small variations, and then there's little flourishes from in the background. So there's not a lot of layers, there's not a ton going on. It's like almost the antithesis of what we were talking about with the complexities of Kobayashi. But at the end of the day, I think what sells it is just how strong the melodic writing is. It's very simple, but it's super, super compelling. All of the melodies are very, I mean, they're memorable and they're charming, and they work in a really like large variety of contexts. I also just find,
yeah, they do.
Yeah, indeed. I find that it's like there's something that, like, I listen to it and I don't know if I'm being biased from looking at it in a more objective sense, because there's something very nostalgic about the general sound of it, from like the way, just like my general knowledge, having seen Lucky Star in the past and like knowing the music, but also just the sound of it is like very 2000s.
Yeah.
Like when it, like usually I'm not a big fan of like artificial instruments, because I'm like of the mind that it's like, I always like the authentic sound better. There's few cases where I lean to liking the synth sound, like where there's that goofiness of it that can be kind of charming. And I think specifically in a lot of these earlier ones where it kind of sounds like its own instrument because it's so far away from what it's aiming for that it almost gives it its own sense of charm. And it's like that cheesy sounding bassoon is like, it's so goofy, and I just love it. I love it. It's
so good.
It's great. And like as I was listening through, I was like, wow, this is really simple. But one of the things as I'm listening to, I'm realizing is, wow, this must have been like amazingly easy to work with.
Yeah.
All of the tracks are very articulate, short, loopable. You can do like anything with them. You could chop them up, move them around. Like, there's so much potential. And I say this specifically because when I was looking into it, I found this interview with Satoru, which I definitely want to reference more in the future because it's pretty extensive. And he talks about his work like on other shows like Haruhi and Monogatari. But there was one where it was asking specifically about like the difference between writing for TV and movies. and he, granted, I'm Google translating this, so it might not be the most accurate, but it's serviceable for our purposes. But essentially what he says, like with movies, it's more common to write like to specific scenes. Whereas with the accompaniment, he delivers, the sound director selects and inserts songs that match the scenes he wants to use. It's going to be used, isn't it? That's why it's better for TV drama accompaniment to have a length that can handle any case. I don't even know which song is used in which scene until I see it on air. So it's like he really took the approach of, I'm going to try and make this as versatile and like usable as possible. Which is, I just think is fascinating that they were very forward with that, like approaching things in a way that would be effective for this specific, field of writing for TV anime. And that's definitely what I noticed when I was watching it, because I listened to the soundtrack. I was like, okay, yeah, there's not as much to it as I thought there might have been in my memory. But then when I was watching the episode, I was like, this is super, like, it fits perfectly. Like the pacing and the way that it can play like this very tiny snippet of a piece of a soundtrack for a comedic beat and then like cut it out and then keep playing it, like, and use these tiny sections of it. And it doesn't sound like awkward or off because of the way that the music is written, and because there's not like too many layers or too much reverb or anything like muddying stuff up, that you can like chop it into pieces like that, works really well for the show. So I was actually kind of impressed with how effective the simplicity of it is.
It's super malleable. I absolutely adore Lucky Star's soundtrack. I don't want to speak on too much of it because it would be all from memory. I unfortunately wasn't able to look back over the show. It was the one show that got kind of left behind because there was a lot of work issues with this film and distribution and pushing it early and stuff. But I absolutely adore Lucky Star, and I did listen to it a bit, and it's so easy to use. Like, it would be so easy to use in a show, and that is such an incredible quality that is like super rare. A lot of composers will think of music first, then usability. I think that one composer that comes to mind where their stuff is very usable is Fujisawa as well. I think Penkin's writing has gotten more usable as also. Mm-hmm. And, I think it's just like a really, really cool trait, and something that when you notice it and you can see it, it's like a really interesting sign of a TV composer, which is a totally like really, really cool skill set. I just want to say this for myself. The first time I had heard of Lucky Star's soundtrack, or heard Lucky Star's soundtrack, was actually in a parody song that Core wrote called They Killed My Dog. It's banger. I listened to it several times. I thought it was very funny and very good. And then I was watching it with like Hiding or something. Like he's like, oh, let's watch Lucky Star. And it played. I was like, wait, it's from this? So I had never seen Lucky Star at the time.
That's quite a throwback. Well, I think that just speaks to how a lot of the melodies are very much like you almost want to write lyrics to them because they have that.
They're so lyrical.
Yeah, they're very lyrical. Well, that's like another thing I noticed, because there were a couple things I noticed. It's like the lyricalness of the melodies, and then also the fact that I was like, this guy, first off, definitely plays piano, because the piano's all over the soundtrack. Second, really good at writing the brass. The brass in general is like super strong. Like I'm thinking of like the Lucky Channel theme.
Yeah.
Like all of that. Anytime there's brass used, that's like it always goes pretty hard. And looking at the interview, well, he writes primarily using piano. and then humming. So it definitely makes sense to get the kind of melodic like mix with those kind of very simple backing. And also he was in a brass band playing trumpet in high school. So of course he knows his brass. It all adds up.
It all adds up. So none of this comes as a surprise. But yeah, I think that's like something interesting about Lucky Star too, is that it's incredibly lyrical, but it's also incredibly malleable. And I would say that combination is not common, because usually the more lyrical something is, the harder it is to chop up. Because usually it's like long sweeping lines, you know. But Lucky Star is just, it's really well written. It's kind of like simplicity taken to the, you know, an art form.
Yeah.
Obviously it is an art form because it's music. Whatever.
I guess there's okay. I have like two last like main points. One of them is like now I'm noticing this, and I'm starting to wonder, is this like a KyoAni thing? Because I feel like maybe I'm not looking hard enough. I don't see it like that often, super often elsewhere. Though it's definitely not uncommon, but I just thought it was funny that specifically in the context of the two KyoAni shows here, there's both cases, because you have all these short, like really simple tracks, a lot of them using like patches, and then for the episode pretty late into the series, which focuses on Konada's mom, it's very emotional. It's like one of the moments where the show actually gets like genuinely emotional, because a lot of the show is more lighthearted, comedic, but there are moments where it tries to tug the heartstrings, and this is one of like the biggest ones. So you get this backstory for Konada's mom. It's a 5-minute scene, and out of the blue comes this lush orchestra with a sweeping trumpet melody. It's 5 minutes long, which is really long if you consider the fact that the majority of the tracks on the soundtrack hardly break a minute, and it's used in this scene specifically. It's literally, the title of it is called Kanata's theme, and it's played in its entirety from start to finish. It lasts like the duration of the entire scene, and I can't imagine it was used anywhere else in the show. Maybe it is, but I feel like that would be kind of weird. It seems like it was very much a track that was written for that moment, which I thought was interesting, because Nichijou also had that scene that was like a 4-minute long sequence that very much was like, this song is for this moment, this scene, which was very funny and interesting, because it's like such a outlier from the rest of the show's score. But the scene itself is also very much an outlier from the rest of the show, so it kind of makes sense. I can imagine that the director was like, this is like a moment we really want to sell, so they came with a more specific like expectation for that particular moment. It
do be like that sometimes. The director comes in and says, hey, time to pull out all the stops.
And indeed he did. I guess the last thing I wanted to mention was some appreciation for the hard work, because it is hard. Because specifically he mentioned, it's like, this may be simple, but there's a lot here. Like there's a large quantity. And this is the quote specifically. He says, "The melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya wasn't that great, but Lucky Star was overwhelming. When I counted the other day, I was making more than 100 songs just for accompaniment, excluding the vocals." So even in the case that it's something that seems pretty simple, it's still a lot that you have to do. There's still so much to get through. So yeah, I thought it was worth appreciating the extent of work that goes into not just this, but all of the series we talked about today.
Yeah, I think people don't realize that any amount of scoring is a lot of scoring. Like it is all a lot of work. Like no matter when the work is done, how, you know, quote unquote, how much work is done, there's someone has to do work somewhere, you know. So,
but yeah. That's Lucky Star. Yeah, I was actually surprised because I had started taking notes on it. I was like, oh, I don't think I'm gonna have that much to say. It's pretty simple, but as I dove into it a bit more, I was surprised that there's a bit more nuance to it than I anticipated.
Yeah, I was happy that you found that, because I didn't actually know. I knew about the interview because you had told me, but I didn't know what was in it, because we don't like talk to each other about our notes. So when we're talking, like, we're both learning from each other, and I think that is what makes it so fun to record these.
Yeah, for sure. But,
yeah, so it was really interesting hearing about all that. So our last little nod, this one we're actually not talking about very much, is just towards Hitoribocchi. Just we thought we wouldn't really have time for it, and I don't think we really do. Really amazing soundtrack, though, that you should definitely check out. Really nice, like, bossa nova, really unique, just a gorgeous score.
Absolutely.
And you should do yourself a favor and listen to it. Yeah.
Actually, I'll say I mentioned I wished that And Yet the Town Moves was a bit more committed to its style, and I think Hitoribocchi is a pretty good example of what I was looking for, because I think even though it ventures outside of the bossa nova Brazilian influence in places, it's overall pretty strongly committed to it and explores a pretty wide range of emotions within that style, which is kind of what I was thinking of. So it's like a good example of my point. But yeah, it's great. Listen to it.
Yeah, it's awesome. If you wanna, this is so random. Sorry, maybe I shouldn't say this, but if you want a good video on Hitoribocchi as well, it's really short. Hollow Bruce, HALLO BRUCE, has a really great video on Hitoribocchi. I just felt like shouting that out because it utilizes the soundtrack in a really good way. So if you want something supplementary to the show and not just the show itself, that's a good video for it. But the show itself is also worth watching, and the soundtrack is worth listening to. So definitely would recommend it.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed the discussions that we had. As always, let us know down below what you'd like to hear us talk about in future episodes, and also what your personal, thoughts are on any of the stuff we discussed, any of the shows, soundtracks. We always appreciate hearing from you guys and learning, because this is a learning experience for all of us. At the end of the day, it's we're just trying to enjoy, appreciate, and understand a bit more.
Yeah. Oh, also, sorry for YouTube comments being disabled on the last video. YouTube kind of freaked out about us being a new channel and stuff like that. Comments should be good to go for all future episodes.
And also, I guess while we're mentioning stuff, I also mention, just for any that are unaware, podcast is also up on Spotify if you're a YouTube listener. So if you prefer listening through that way, it's there. Link in the description. Also, both of our Twitters. And I guess I'll also mention, if you enjoyed this podcast, do consider maybe sharing it around with somebody else that you think might appreciate it. And we can help widen the world of anime OST aficionados.
Tack more words on there. All right. Thank you so much, guys. It's been a pleasure. Catch you in the next one.
You have a good one.